They're open. On. Battery. On and set. Idle cutter. Fine, 4 lights. Inverter still off. Aircraft bin.
Once upon a lake there was a boat. The lake was Gander in Newfoundland. The boat was a flying boat called Southern Cross. The month was October. The year was 1980. She was 37 years old. The temperature -10 degrees centigrade. The Arctic winter had arrived. The lake began to freeze. How did she get to Gander? What was she doing there, 30 years out of her time? Why did they call her?
Beachcomber, all air control. You are cleared to Rose Bay, VFR. Surface wind 275, 15 knots, QFE 1015.
Lord Howe Control, Beachcomber. Message received and understood. See you in a couple of days. Thank you. Bye-bye.
This is the story of Sunderland JM 715 that spanned a period of over 40 years. In 1943, Short Brothers of Belfast built a Sunderland. It was just one of many. They built hundreds. To this one they gave, as usual, a number. It was JM 715. She was flown to Wigg Bay near Stranraer to be in reserve for the operational Sunderland squadrons to replace those shot down by the enemy. Late in 1944, she was flown back to Belfast and converted from a Sunderland to a civil airliner, a Sandringham. So she lost her chance in war, but a very different and quite extraordinary life awaited her in the blue tropical waters of the Pacific and in the island paradise of the Caribbean. She was to become one of the last 2 flying Sunderlands in the world. Her conversion involved a streamlined nose and tail, the replacement of her 4 Bristol Pegasus engines with more powerful American twin Wasps, and the creation within her hull on 2 decks, passenger cabins, toilets, dining room, kitchen and a bar. Her small round portholes were replaced by wide passenger viewing windows, and she was soundproofed and furnished to a standard of luxury undreamed of by the RAF crews who flew her sisters. A famous airline pilot said she was a ship that flew. JM 715, now resplendent in her new glory, was sold to Tasman Empire Airlines of New Zealand, given the registration ZK-AMH, named Auckland, and flown out there into the heart of the Pacific to enter airline service on the new Auckland-Sydney route. She was purchased to replace the old short C-class Empire boats, which Teal had been using since before the war. She operated the Auckland to Rose Bay, Sydney route until 1950. Then, just as BOAC scrapped all its 4-engine big boats in the October of that year, and Qantas, the Australian airline, had already embarked on the change to land planes, JM715 was sold again, becoming VH-BRC Beachcomber of Ansett Air Services. Now she started to fly the Rose Bay Lord Howe Island route. The island is 480 miles out in the Pacific, east of Sydney, and was, even then in 1950, a thriving community on Holiday Island. In 1950, the Australian government, taking notice of the fact that Lord Howe had no airfield, paid a subsidy to the flying boat services. And because, in common with many tropic islands all over the world, it had a large lagoon protected by a reef, This was enough. Flying boats could operate where no land plane could go. The result of this was that just as the major airlines of the world were discarding the big flying boats as obsolete, JM 715, now Beachcomber, went into regular airline service while most of her sisters were going to the scrap heap. What is even more amazing is the fact that she was to go on flying this route for the next 24 years. The wand of fate had given her a glittering future indeed. When she came to the end of it in 1974, having been joined in 1963 by her companion Sandringham Islander, these two were the only two flying big boats in the world, and she would be 31 years old. So in 1974, Beachcomber, or perhaps as she must always be called through changes of name and airlines, JM 715, came to what everybody thought was the end of the line. The Australian government had withdrawn its subsidy to Ansett and built an airfield on Lord Howe Island. This made the flying boat services uneconomic, and in the latter half of that year, Beachcomber and Islander ceased operations. The Rose Bay base was to be closed. The hangars would be dismantled and removed, and the whole place turned into a public park. This, everybody said, was the end of an era, the end of the golden age of the big boats. But fate and history had not finished with Beachcomber yet, not by a long way. She had a future, and in that future, she was to make flights of a magnitude that no other Sandringham had ever made or ever will. Over and round the curve of the world, 10,000 miles away, a famous American flying boat captain, Charles Blair, was operating an airline out of the United States Virgin Islands in the Caribbean called Antilles Airboats. Now, Blair had heard of these last two big boats, Beachcomber and Islander. He had flown flying boats for Pan American in the great days of their Pacific operation. All these boats, like those of BOAC, Qantas and Teal, had long gone to the scrapyard 30 years before. He'd come over to Sydney some time before and expressed an interest in the boats if Ansett were ever to get rid of them. Now he moved quickly and bought them both. He flew over to Sydney and both were renamed, painted in Antilles Airboats livery and re-registered with American registrations. Beachcomber became N158C Southern Cross and Islander became N158J Excalibur VIII. He took Excalibur back to the Virgin Islands, leaving Rose Bay on the 25th of September 1974. This historic film of the last days of Rose Bay was taken by a 16-year-old boy, Charles Shipley, who lived close to the flying boat base. He had flown in the two big boats to Lord Howe Island, and getting to know what was happening, had come to a decision. He was going to get his dad's 8mm cine camera and film the end of this era in Australian history, and this is exactly what he did. It seemed very strange to him to see his beloved Beachcomber, now named Southern Cross, and with Antilles Airboats on her side instead of Ansett, and with Charles Blair's great black hawk on the bright scarlet fin. He'd seen Charles Blair arrive for the second time and knew that it was only a matter of days until the last big boat would leave forever and Rose Bay would witness its final hours as Australia's marine airport. As could be expected, the whole marine airport and its faithful, long-serving employees were in a mood of deep melancholy. The old terminal was now dusty and deserted, with peeling posters of Lord Howe Island on its silent walls. The hangar was empty, the slipway abandoned and forsaken, as Southern Cross floated quietly in the boarding dock, awaiting her test flight before final departure. In the afternoon of a November day in 1974, Captain Blair and his crew went aboard and started the engines for the test flight. It was an overcast day, but with little wind and a high cloud base, ideal conditions. As Blair taxied Southern Cross down the long reach towards Sydney Harbour Bridge, the coat hanger as the locals call it, Charles Shipley went on filming. He had no help, no camera instruction. He cadged lifts on the escort launches and standing up, trying to balance himself against the movement of the craft with a handheld camera without tripod or stand. He recorded not only the end of an era in historical terms, but what he himself perhaps regarded as the end of an era in his own emotional terms also. What of course this young boy was producing was this astounding record for posterity. On board Southern Cross, Blair opened up the engines and away down the harbour she went. Lightly loaded for the test flight, she was soon on the front step, planing over the water with that glorious white plume from her bows that makes a flying boat take off a unique and special delight for passenger and observer alike. Until, with a final surge and unstick, she climbed into her second element, the air. Away she went, up and over the Sydney suburbs, with young Charles struggling to keep her in focus from the pitching and rolling launch. The test flight did not last long. There was a problem with the port inner engine. It had high cylinder head temperatures and low oil pressure. Considering that he would be taking Southern Cross on a 10,000-mile flight to the Virgin Islands, including a flight right across the vast expanse of the Pacific, Blair shut down the engine, feathered the propeller, and returned to land on 3. Southern Cross was moored up and then put back in the boarding dock. The engineer's inspection revealed metal in the oil filters, so she was removed from the water, taken back into the hangar where the offending engine was taken out and a new one fitted. No chances could be taken with the Trans-Pacific flight in prospect. With the new engine in position and the airscrew refitted, the flying boat was returned to the water and a second successful test flight made. She was then returned to the boarding dock to await departure. Last-minute checks were given to the whole aircraft, both inside and out. All equipment checked and positioned. 2,772 gallons of fuel taken on, and the departure time agreed with flight control. The countdown to the end of Rose Bay Base had begun. The time for farewells had come, and all the farewells had been said. On the 28th of November 1974, at 17:25 hours local time, Southern Cross started up her engines in the boarding dock. Then, with flags flying and streams of blue exhaust smoke, she surged forward, and the last flying boat to leave Rose Bay had departed. Behind her, the marine airport was dead. There were few to see her go, but Charles Shipley was there, in his place, in the escorting launch. A 28-knot wind blew down the harbour as Southern Cross, deep in the water from an overload of nearly 2,000 pounds, mostly fuel, ploughed and buffeted her way to the takeoff point for the non-stop flight out into the world's greatest ocean, to Pago Pago in US Samoa, 2,392 nautical miles away. On the flight deck, Captain Blair opened the throttles, and the 31-year-old Southern Cross set out on her greatest journey. She accelerated slowly at first, her aft hull deep in the water from the weight that she was carrying. But gradually, full power, she began to rise onto the front step, thundering through the water in a great cloud of spray, a sight that Sydney would see no more, a sound that Sydney would hear no more. After some 50 seconds, she left the water and climbed away over the harbour bridge. Sydney Flight Control called her.
You are cleared to Pago Pago under VFR. Maintain 1,500 feet while cleared in the Sydney control zone.
Bland, laconic, the voice without a sign that this was anything more than a routine flight. There was one last duty left. Captain Blair brought Southern Cross back over Rose Bay and gave a farewell salute to the home she had served so well for 24 years. Charles Shipley put away his camera. Everybody went home. The big boats had gone from Australia. Old JM 715 accomplished a non-stop flight to Pago Pago in US Samoa without a flutter. 2,392 nautical miles in 16 hours and 52 minutes. Then, following in the great tradition of her long-gone sisters and ancestors, proceeded to reel off the miles and stages of the flight to her new home in the Caribbean, half a world away. Pago Pago to Honolulu, 2,263 nautical miles in 17 hours 57 minutes. Honolulu to Los Angeles, 2,277 nautical miles in 16 hours 50 minutes. Then, gathering her strength and climbing above the 9,000-foot mountains of California, she flew over the entire continental United States of America, from Los Angeles to Miami in Florida, 2,069 nautical miles in 14 hours 45 minutes. With the scent of islands once again in her nostrils, she then flew 900 nautical miles south to St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands in 6 hours, a mere doddle, and finally to rest at St. Croix, a 35-minute hop. As she descended in a long, curved landing approach, There on the blue water, resting at her moorings, was N158J Islander. So the world's last two big boats were united once more, 10,000 miles away from their previous home, Rose Bay. In the azure lagoon of St. Croix, Antilles Airboats main base, with the sun gleaming on their wings, floated the last two flying big boats in the world. And as he happily surveyed them, he must have been very proud and thrilled that they belonged to him, Charles Blair. Captain Blair planned to use Southern Cross and Excalibur for inclusive air tour cruises around the Caribbean, a completely new concept in 1975. Holidaymakers could relax in the well-furnished cabins with first-class cabin service. They could observe through the huge windows the whole exotic panorama of the seas and coral islands of the West Indies going by below them. The flight altitude could be as low as 500 to 1,000 feet, the speed of flight around 150 miles an hour. He could afford a package deal that took in the whole of that sun-soaked fantasy world, each tropically scented night bringing a new hotel on a new island. What a far cry from Wig Bay. By linking up with American Airlines, who already operated a New York to St. Croix service, a complete itinerary opening up to the whole USA could be offered. The cruise would take 8 days, routing from St. Croix to Antigua, to St. Lucia, to Martinique, to Saint-Martin, and back to St. Croix. Names and places to conjure with now, never mind in 1974. Only 5 flight sectors were involved, the longest being only 2.5 hours, so the maximum time at each resort could be offered, and at a very relaxed pace. Blair wished to capitalise on the unique experience, charm and practical advantage of which only a flying boat was capable. It could not be matched by land planes due to lack of airports, or by ships, which being so much slower, could not attempt such a journey in anything like the time factor or the cost factor. It was, to say the least, a unique and unbeatable holiday tour. So Charles Blair, who thought that in December of '74 he'd overcome all his difficulties and had now got the 2 big boats to his base in the Virgin Islands, set out to develop the air services that had been in his mind for a long time. It was then that something happened that neither he nor anybody else had ever foreseen. At one stroke, it brought all his plans and dreams to nothing. The United States government refused to give him a C of A to fly passengers in Islander, now Excalibur. Blair pleaded in vain that she had a full C of A in Australia, that had been flying passengers for 11 years on the Sydney Lord Howe Island route. The Civil Aeronautics Authority of the USA would not budge. No C of A would be given. Blair then found that this applied to the rest of the world also. The reason given was that Islander's conversion from a Sunderland to a Sandringham had been done by Ansett and not by Short Brothers. Therefore, Islander, according to them, was a one-off, a new type of aircraft, a hybrid, and no full of C of A would be given to a hybrid. This shattering decision, quite unthought of by Ansett, did not apply to Southern Cross. She was converted by Short Brothers and accordingly was one of a type which was approved to fly passengers in Britain, America, and everywhere else, as were her many production line sister ships purchased by BOAC, Qantas, Teal, Dodero of Argentina, Corsa of Brazil, and many others. But Islander, no. She was a mongrel, a half-breed, a hybrid, and that was that. Blair's deal for the Caribbean cruises in conjunction with American Airlines fell through. Islander Excalibur was flown to the old US Navy base on Isla Grande, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and put into the hangar there. She never flew for Antilles airboats again and was left to rot from 1974 until 1980. It says a great deal about the character of Charles Blair that he refused to give up his dream of operating big boats, and Southern Cross let him hold on to it. Not only did he rise above the ill-fated Caribbean operations, but typically he aimed way above it. In 1976, he and JM 715 Southern Cross planned the ultimate. Flights across the North Atlantic to Europe, two-way crossings in a 33-year-old propeller-driven flying boat in the jet age. A proving flight was needed, so Blair decided to bring her to Ireland, where he had family connections. His wife was Hollywood film star Maureen O'Hara, and they had a home there close by Bantry Bay. So it was to be, as of course the Irish will tell you that the little people knew all along that Southern Cross would come back to the land of her birth, and come back in style, under her own power, crossing the North Atlantic in the process, and bearing an Irish princess called Maureen O'Hara. What more could it possibly need to make the harps play and the Guinness flow? Yes, this was a unique event, yet another in the life of JM 715. No Sandringham had ever flown the North Atlantic, and apart from JM 715, no other ever did. But the fairy tale didn't stop there. In 1976, Southern Cross made the first of her double crossings, west to east, and then the far more difficult east to west, which, from the time technology allowed the first attempt to the present age of the big jets, has meant fighting a headwind all the way. With the 747s of this age, the flight time difference can be as much as 1.5 to 2 hours. In the case of Southern Cross, it meant a difference of 5.5 to 6 hours, she being an aircraft with the technology of the 40s. In 1977, she and Captain Blair did the double voyage again, bringing the total of her Atlantic crossings to 4. While in Ireland, Southern Cross visited Foynes, Glengarriff, the Aran Islands, Loch Corrib, Killaloe, Belfast Loch, that was for a visit to Short Brothers, and went on to Poole in Dorset, the main BRAC base of their big boats in the 40s, to give pleasure flights to anybody who wished to get an idea what it was like to be a flying boat passenger flying the world in those wonderful days of the big boats 40 years before. Having stayed for 2 months, Blair departed from Killaloe on September the 7th and flew back to the Virgin Islands via Gander Lake, Boston and St. Thomas. Southern Cross sailed over the Atlantic for the 4th time. That year, 1977, was her 34th birthday, and she spent it in some style. The next year, 1978, would doubtless have brought new flights and adventures to Charles Blair and Southern Cross. Their joint excursions were becoming a legend in aviation history, just as Charles Blair's flying career was before they both met up. But in that year came tragedy. Charles Blair was killed in a flying accident. Flying lost one of its greatest sons, and JM 715 lost her mentor. With the death of Captain Blair, Southern Cross, like Islander, was retired. Islander had already been put in store in a hangar at San Juan in Puerto Rico 5 years before, and Southern Cross, now 35 years old, joined her. No doubt it was there that they would have ended their days, but the worldwide but dwindling little band of boatmen all getting older and older, like the two survivors of their age of the big boats, were not content to just let them die. Word went out, the news got around, and two equally determined projects got underway. Their object? To bring the two magnificent, unique old ladies back to the land of their birth once more, over the North Atlantic to Great Britain, where they would be maintained and displayed instead of rotting on a Caribbean island and melted down for scrap. This, to the boatmen, was emotionally unthinkable. Southern Cross and Islander would both return. JM 715 was the first to go. After more than a year-long struggle dogged by huge repair bills and low finance, full of problems and drama, the flight from San Juan to the jumping-off point for the North Atlantic crossing, Gander Lake, started. This was to be her fifth and most vital crossing. It was to be her last crossing, and it so nearly didn't happen at all. Painted a drab greeny yellow, a blue rudder, Southern Cross set off for Gander Lake. It was October 1980. The flight had become a race against time and the North Atlantic winter.
November 158 Charlie, do you read, please, over? November 158 Charlie, this is Gander Control, receiving you loud and clear, over. This is November 158 Charlie, transit Boston to Gander Lake. We have lost an engine. Repeat, we have lost an engine. Our position is 45 degrees 20 minutes north, 62 degrees 42 minutes west. We are not in immediate need of assistance. Repeat, not in immediate need of assistance. Over.
One of the engines started giving trouble up the coast of Halifax, Nova Scotia. The oil level became dangerously low, and an attempt was made to shut down the engine. The airscrew refused to feather at first, and went through several phases of almost stopping, then overspeeding, until with the oil level reading 0, the crew finally got it feathered and stopped.
What is your weather? I'm completely iced up, over. November 158 Charlie, Gander weather, wind 035 degrees 20 knots, snow showers, QNH 1003, cloud base 2,200 feet, visibility 3 miles down to 1 mile-inch showers. Lakeshore is frozen, patches of pancake ice on surface, over. Thank you, Gander. I'm calling Halifax, and we'll call you back. Over and out. Halifax, this is November 158 Charlie. Do you read, over?
November 158 Charlie, this is Halifax. Loud and clear, over.
Thank you, Halifax. We are transit Boston to Gander Lake and have lost an engine. Our position is 45 degrees 20 minutes north, 62 degrees 42 minutes west. We are in contact with Gander and are not, repeat, not in immediate need of assistance, over.
Thank you, 158 Charlie. We will listen out on emergency frequency and contact Gander, over.
The crippled aircraft then flew through rain squalls in sub-zero temperatures and picked up a great deal of ice. So much that the crew were completely unable to see out.
158 Charlie, understand your ETA 11:42 GMT. We will inform Gander, listening out, over.
On 3 engines and blind, Captain Gillies made the approach to Gander Lake and radar control. The final landing was made by side-slipping the big boat and the captain peering out of the open side window of the cockpit. But land she did, with the psychological problem being that the next leg facing them was the crossing of the great ocean from Gander to Shannon, with winter breathing down their necks. So as I said in the beginning, once upon a lake there was a boat, and now you know how she got there and what she still had to do. At Gander it was found that the loss of oil was due to a cracked cylinder. That had to be changed out on the lake. In temperatures as low as -10 degrees centigrade, and due to the oil suffering the effects of extreme cold, in the end, no test flight was possible. What brought matters to a head was that when they had landed, ice had already begun to form on the lake edges, and by now the entire lake was beginning to freeze over. If they did not leave at once, takeoff would be impossible and the flying boat would be destroyed, crushed by the ice. So at 19:30 GMT, on the 23rd of October 1980, Captain Gillies opened up the engines and lifted JM 715 Southern Cross off the remaining unfrozen water of the lake in a blizzard. The fifth crossing of the North Atlantic had begun. She never let them down. 37 years old and in the night of winter, flying at 1,000 feet, unheated, unpressurized, through ice and storm, she brought them across in 12 hours and 30 minutes to landfall in a grey Irish dawn at Bantry Bay at 0800 GMT, and then via Shannon Airport to a Loch Derg touchdown on the 24th of October 1980. JM 715 was home. Home in the island where she had been converted into a Sandringham 37 years ago. When Captain Gillies was asked to comment, he said the eggs and bacon had never tasted better. It was not until February 1981 that JM 715 Southern Cross was to make what proved to be her last flight. Captain Gillies came back to Loch Derg, where she had been moored since her Atlantic crossing. She was to fly to Calshot, England, at the end of Southampton water. On February the 2nd, the captain and his crew came aboard, and when everything was ready, he pressed the starter buttons. The moorings were slipped and a routine takeoff made. Climbing to 6,500 feet in the cloudy Irish skies, she went across the Irish Sea, over Bristol, then descending to 1,500 feet, passed over the Royal Naval Air Station, Yeovilton, onto Southampton, and a radar descent through the cloud over Eastleigh Airport, up the long estuary to Calshot Spit. Her flying career was over, but they didn't know that then. For them, the men who would not let her die, would not let her rot in the Caribbean, the next battle was only just beginning. So the world's last Sandringham Southern Cross stayed on the spit at Calshot until July the 8th, 1981. The Hampshire County Council, on whose property she stood, were very anxious to get rid of her and applied considerable pressure. Calshot was termed an adventure playground and activities area for school children, and in their wisdom they could see neither adventure nor activity from Southern Cross. That old flying boat was just in the way. One of the teachers who thronged the place teaching dinghy sailing thought it was a heap of junk. Technically correct, but emotionally it hurt. All this time efforts were being made in all directions to raise money to make her airworthy again. No money was forthcoming. Much to the amazement of all concerned, the city, industry, aviation, and the establishment in general turned its back on Southern Cross, and months of weary, slogging effort went for nothing. In May 1981, the San Juan second project came to fulfillment. As JM 715 Southern Cross stood outside the hangar on the end of Calshot Spit, down out of the clouds and onto Southampton water came N158J Islander. Once again, the world's last two big boats were together for a short time, until Islander took off again for her new base in the south of France. On the 8th of July, Captain Vic Hodgkinson and flight engineer Dick Froggatt got her back into the water and made a taxi voyage of 1.5 hours across Southampton water to the Royal Naval Base at Lyon, Solent. She was hauled out once more by the Navy, and at last she was safe there until plans could be made for her future. These two men, who were two of the world's most experienced flying boat pilots and engineers, then came to the conclusion that Southern Cross's flying days were over, and all efforts were put towards her preservation in a place where she could be visited by the general public and, if possible, restored to her former glory. So she stayed in the care of the Royal Navy at HMS Daedalus, Leon Solent, until in 1983 the Science Museum and the yet unbuilt Southampton Hall of Aviation gladly took her to their bosom. To the men who had stayed with her, who had kept faith, it was and had been an adventure of the spirit, and one that they would never forget. So she had to be moved from Leon Solent to Southampton. Because of her condition, there was no possibility of doing what they all wanted to do: fly down to Southampton with all flags waving and make a triumphant last landing by the East Dock, or at least taxi down on the step with the sea pluming in white foam from her bows, engines thundering out a last farewell. No, that was romantic fiction. They had, so to speak, to come down out of the clouds. Practicality and logic had to take over. She had to be taken to Southampton on a mighty motorised barge supplied by the 17th Port Regiment of the Royal Corps of Transport. In fact, without them, she could never have been moved at all. And what a wonderful job they did. On the 28th of February, the day dawned sunny and bright. The tide arrived, the wind dropped. A beautiful cold winter's day. It was fingers crossed and all systems go. The race against time and weather, which was no stranger to Southern Cross, began once again. The surge of white water at the rear of the barge gave the signal that Southern Cross was leaving Leon Solent and the Royal Navy, who had cared for her so well, for the last time. A great cheer went up from the crowd of over 500 people who had turned up to watch and who had stood there for several hours in the cold winter sunshine of this February day. The huge engines of the barge took her out into the long arm of Southampton water, tightly lashed down against any vagaries of the weather that might come up, our flags flying in the breeze from the mast behind the flight deck that every civil flying boat carried. Escorted by control launches and helicopters of the Royal Navy, she began the short voyage down these historic waters. A flying boat base at Calshot, founded in 1913, renowned for Henry VIII's castle and the home in the 30s of the Schneider Trophy seaplanes designed by Reg Mitchell, which won the trophy outright for Britain on September the 13th, 1931. And where 2 weeks later, Flight Lieutenant Stainforth, flying an S-6B seaplane, also designed by Mitchell, set up a new world air speed record of 407.8 miles an hour. Just imagine that in 1931. Hamble and the Hamble River, where the Marine Aircraft Depot was set up in 1914 and which has had an association with marine aircraft ever since. Where the greatest of all her big boat ancestors, the C-Class Empire flying boats, were broken up in 1946-47, without a single one being saved for posterity. At least this tragic mistake has not been made again. If it had, it is doubtful that history would ever have forgiven us. Down the estuary is Hythe, where May, Harden and May and Holt Thomas built Port Felixstowe flying boats in the First World War with 3 Rolls-Royce engines and a huge wingspan of 124 feet, bigger than that of Southern Cross. Where in the 30s, the short C-Class Empire boats started the civil airline trunk routes of Imperial Airways, and going on through the 30s, 40s and 50s, the big boats, the Sunderlands, Hythes, Sandringhams and Solents of BOAC, carried the flag to the 4 corners of the earth, until finally phased out in 1950. Yet still, Aquila Airways went on with Hythes and Solents until 1958. Historic waters indeed. So Southern Cross journeys down the last few miles of her life, ticking off the years with the miles. A life that has stretched from Whig Bay in Scotland in 1944, on to New Zealand in 1947 as ZKAMH Auckland, in 1950 to Australia as VH-BRC Beachcomber, in 1974 to the Caribbean as VP LVE Southern Cross of Antilles Airboats, then 5 crossings of the North Atlantic in 1976 and again in 1977. Then finally in 1980-81, when she was 38 years old, the 5th and last Atlantic crossing to Calshot. Here she is on what deserves to be her royal barge of state in 1983, sailing through the sunshine of a winter's day in the country of her birth. Those old engines will never turn again. No longer will she ride the air routes of the world. But what a saga, a legend she has created. An historical record set in time forever. The last of her line, coming home to the very place, the very water where the big boats had pioneered their routes in 1936, 47 years ago in Southampton. Very slowly and with great care, Southern Cross comes ashore. First the tail trolley, then foot by foot the rest of her. Soon the khaki paint and the drab blue rudder will be stripped off, and she will return to our proud Ansett colours of Australia and her name, Beachcomber. Atlantic crossings apart, that was how she spent 25 years of her 39 years of flying life. It was now that the young men took over from the old men. The boys of 424 Squadron Air Training Corps, under the direction of their commanding officer, Squadron Leader Alan Jones, backed up by many dedicated enthusiasts, dismantled her, removed her to the museum site, and re-erected her in the place where she now proudly stands. So with JM 715, as in life itself, real achievement happens by the old inspiring the young, and the young giving of their own strength and interpretation. Now in the Southampton Hall of Aviation, it is the 26th of May 1984, opening day. Together with the fame of R.J. Mitchell, the Spitfire and the magnificent seaplanes of the Schneider Trophy, she is there, fully restored for all to come, see and wonder at. People who have never seen a big boat fly can at least see her in the flesh, while those who had flown them or flown in them can bring their children and their children's children and proudly say, this is how it really was.